So when we think about canonization, how were these decisions made? How do you decide whether something is inspired or not inspired? Well, there are a number of criteria that you can apply to them, and some of them are pretty logical. In fact, if I asked you to come up with a list of what makes something scriptural or not, you'd probably come up with a very similar criteria. First of all, the first criteria is date and language. That seems like two criteria, but it's really just one, and that's because in the Old Testament, were these texts written in Hebrew? If they're written in Hebrew, then they're probably written prior to 400 BC, so that gives a good date range on the language. In the New Testament context, we want those documents written sometime in the 1st century, when that first generation that walked with Jesus was still alive. The second criteria is inspiration. Does the text make a claim for inspiration? In the Old Testament, you're looking for that phrase, "Thus says Yahweh," or "Thus says the Lord," as many Bible translations have it. In the New Testament, you'd like an apostolic association. You don't have to be an apostle to get your book in the New Testament, but you have to know one. It's always who you know. In the case of Matthew and John, tradition always associated those with the apostles, and so their texts are in with no problem. In the case of Mark and Luke, however, they're not apostles, so how do they get their book into the Bible? Well, tradition says that Mark was an interpreter for Peter, and Luke was a traveling companion of Paul. So because of those apostolic associations, those texts get into the text. The third criteria we put in place would probably be orthodoxy. There are no strange ideas, that these conform to understood, accepted beliefs of the later church. Now, those three criteria are the ones that probably make the most sense. They're the ones that are most logical. They're the ones that you would have come up with if I'd asked you to come up with a list of criteria, I'm sure. The fourth one, however, is the wild card. It is the criteria that can trump all of the rest, and that is time and usage. Did the writing stand the test of time? Did they speak to the needs of the community? The reality is that you can have books of that are in the Bible that do not hold to the first three criteria, but because of time and usage, made it into the text. And you can also have books that would meet those top three criteria that are not in the biblical text. Gosh, that sounds like a pretty radical statement, I hear you say. Can you back it up, Dr. Wallace? I'm glad you asked that question, because yes, I can. Let me give you the first example in a case of a book that meets the first three criteria but is not in the text. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9, Paul says, "In my earlier letter I wrote to you." So that's 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9. Paul refers to an earlier letter. Well, if Paul is writing it, it's certainly written in the 1st century. If Paul is writing it, we don't have a question of apostolic association. And if Paul is writing it, I don't have any problems with an issue of orthodoxy. But for whatever reason, that earlier letter to the Corinthians that came prior to 1 Corinthians doesn't make it into the text. So what happened? Why? Well, it didn't speak to the needs of the community. There was lost to the history of the church in time. There was something about that text that just did not have that same quality of inspiration. Likewise, at the end of the book of Colossians, Paul says that when you read this book, make sure and share this letter to the Laodiceans, and make sure and read my letter to the Laodiceans. I don't have a letter to the Laodiceans in my Bible. Well, Paul apparently thought it was special, but I guess God didn't, because over time and history, that text has been lost. So there are examples of texts that meet those first three criteria that aren't in the text. Now, what about the other kind, the ones that violate the first three criteria but find themselves in the Bible? Probably the best example of that would be the Book of Esther. Esther is written very, very late. In fact, there are portions of it in Aramaic, so it's after that 400 BC deadline that you normally think of for the Old Testament books. Esther never mentions God, so it doesn't have "Thus says Yahweh." And in the case of orthodoxy, the Book of Esther actually advocates the celebration of a non-Mosaic holiday. In other words, a holiday that Moses didn't set up in the Torah is in the Book of Esther. That is the holiday of Purim. On top of that, the hero of the Book of Esther is Mordecai, whose name shares remarkable similarities to the Babylonian god Marduk. And the heroine, Esther's name, shares remarkable similarities to the goddess Ishtar, another Babylonian goddess. So they're named after Babylonian gods. They celebrate non-Mosaic holidays. They're not written in Hebrew, portions of it not written in Hebrew, and it was written very late and never mentions God. So how in the world does the Book of Esther end up in the Bible? Well, it spoke to the needs of the community. There was something special about that book that you couldn't put a quality on. You didn't meet those basic criteria. And I think that's one of the reasons I kind of like this idea of the canonization. When I first heard this lecture, when I first listened to this, when I was sitting where you were sitting and listening to this lecture about these criteria, this really bothered me because all of a sudden it sounded like it was a popularity contest of what went into the Bible and what didn't go into the Bible. But I finally discovered you need to go a little Microsoft on this. This is not a bug, this is a feature. Because what that ends up meaning is you can't quantify the inspiration of God. There is no way in which you can apply certain objective criteria and say, yes, see, that is inspired by God, that is not inspired by God. It's a lot less a science when it comes to the inspiration of God than it is a little more of an art. In fact, I've often likened it to selecting a quarterback from the NFL draft. That's how you can tell whether or not a book is inspired. Let me explain that. Before the draft comes, for those sports fans out there, before the NFL draft comes, football coaches, GMs, scouts, they get a huge list of qualities of collegiate football players. Size, arm strength, winning percentage, the offensive system that they were in college, the pass completion rate, all these objective, very statistical categories that you can look at. And they evaluate every quarterback the same way. His height, his weight, how much you can bench press, all those things. And then comes the NFL draft, and they have to make a decision. They need to draft a quarterback that will win for their particular franchise. And what happens? Well, sometimes you get Peyton Manning, sometimes you get Ryan Leaf. Sometimes you get Andrew Luck, sometimes you get Cade McNown. There's huge, surprising problems when it comes to picking an NFL quarterback. Sometimes you do well, sometimes you don't. It turns out that sometimes these top draft picks, the ones that just absolutely can't miss, absolutely do. And then you have these other draft picks that people have undergone the same evaluation, and yet they get picked in the 3rd round like Joe Montana, or even the 6th round like Tom Brady. I mean, every team in the league had 6 chances at Tom Brady and passed on him. Wasn't tall enough, didn't have a strong enough arm, didn't play the right offense in college, and yet Tom Brady goes on to win the Super Bowls that he has. The Book of Esther is Tom Brady. I would never tell him that personally, and please don't show this video to him. That would be a problem. But that one book that doesn't look like it actually meets any of these criteria, and yet goes on to make it into the biblical text. That earlier letter to the Corinthians, that would be the Ryan Leaf, Jamarcus Russell parable. That looked like it should go in the Bible, but for whatever reason, it doesn't. So you see that these criteria, I like the fact that you can't quantify God in that way. God's special inspiration works beyond the scientific objective criteria, and I think that is probably one of the features.